second nature. No, you just, it's something like that.
Can we have our forestry panel speakers come up, please?
Oh, I've joined at the hip with it.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is that close enough?
I think so. Your mouth is moving and nothing is coming out.
Yeah, we also have a laptop, so you too? No, I don't. Trivia. I would say I do use it as a tool. I don't
Deanna, are we okay to get started?
Yes.
Good morning. My name's Julee Boan. I'm the Boreal Program Manager with Ontario Nature. I'm also a PhD candidate at Lakehead University, studying the mitigation of timber harvesting impacts on woodland caribou. And it's my pleasure to introduce our forestry speakers this morning. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Sara Teitelbaum. Sara is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Quebec. Her research interests cover the range of issues related to the socioeconomic aspects of forest management. Her postdoc and PhD both focus on the implementation of community forestry in a Canadian context. Sara also works as a consultant, and she works regularly as an auditor with the Forest Stewardship Council certification process through the Smartwood. And she lives in Montreal. Welcome, Sara. So let me just make sure I figure this thing out. Is it the little arrows, or? Okay. No, I just want to know that it works, and then I'll introduce myself a little more. So anyway, I can start talking a little bit. So yeah, as Julie mentioned, I'm from Montreal, and for about 10 years I've been lucky enough to study all the socioeconomic issues related to forestry in Canada and in the boreal forest. And the topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and visiting different community forests and so on is community forestry. And for my PhD, I did an analysis of 4 different community forests, and I really looked at basically an evaluation of those community forests to see to what extent the ideas behind that whole concept were reflected in the practices of those organizations. And then, and then I have the chance to do some different consulting work as a sort of social forester. And one of the contracts that I did last year was I wrote a report for Greenpeace called Building a Green Economy in the Boreal Forest. So, very apropos for today. And so I had a chance to spend some time analyzing the whole forest industry context and coming up with some policy recommendations for how we can move the boreal economy towards a greener blueprint. So I'm going to share some of those policy recommendations with you today. So my presentation is really going to be on the more general side, and I can illustrate with a few examples, and then hopefully I'm kind of setting the context nicely for our next speakers, who I think are going to be talking about things that are a little bit more specific. So, there we go. So, Ontario's Crown land, a vast forest. I believe somewhere between 80 and 90% of all of Ontario's forests are in the public domain, which in theory presents a really interesting opportunity for all of Ontarians in so much as they're all really the owners of the forest. The pattern for more than a century now has been to allocate the rights to that public forest to the private sector, primarily to private forest companies. That's the case all across Canada. And over the years, forest companies have been handed over more and more responsibilities as all the sort of social values of Canadians and Ontarians evolve. The forest companies have been asked to take into consideration more and more constraints on their harvesting operations, so things like protecting ecological functions, consulting with the public, preserving wildlife, and it's gotten more and more complicated and more expensive to integrate into the planning system all of these various values and priorities of Canadians. Not to forget that Ontario's Crown land is also the homeland for more than 100 First Nations communities who in many cases have activities and values on the land base which also need to be respected and which sometimes come into conflict with the forest industry activities. And so there's a whole realm of negotiation around that as well. So I just happened to see this quote in the Globe and Mail the other day when I started thinking about this presentation, and I thought it was kind of funny. It indicates how investors for the last number of years have been seeing the forest industry. As investments go, wood has not been pretty over the past decade or so. That's actually a massive understatement. Wood fell out of the ugly tree and hit every branch on the way down. So it's sort of an indication of where we've been at since around 2000 in terms of how the forest industry has been doing. And when I wrote this report for Greenpeace, I had a chance to pull up a whole bunch of statistics around what's going on in the forest industry in the boreal regions of Ontario and Quebec. So I'll just share some of that with you. So, basically, I've heard the forest industry situation described as a perfect storm. And there's a number of reasons for the difficult economic context, some of which are, I think, more particular to the market, and then other ones which are potentially more systemic. Some of the ones that are more particular are things like competition from other foreign countries like Brazil and China, places where you can grow trees in a third the time that you can grow them in Northern Ontario. Some of those places have also been investing a lot more money in new mills and updating old mills and in new technology, and so they have a real competitive advantage over Canadian mills. There's also been difficult economic times in the US with a slow housing market and slow construction industry. There's been the softwood lumber dispute. There's been the strong Canadian dollar, which has made our market advantage to be less. And there's also been, on a more systemic level, declining quality and quantity of the wood supply. There's the regulatory system in Ontario, which is potentially a fair bit more expensive than in some other countries, partly for good reason, in order to protect ecological attributes and all that type of stuff, but also a certain amount of administrative inefficiencies. So yeah, here's a few of those statistics that I was talking about. So the consequences of the industry downturn has been pretty stark, especially for small communities in Northern Ontario, Quebec, BC, all across Canada. For example, in Ontario, the harvest levels are now half of what they were in 1990. That has some potentially interesting consequences from an environmental perspective, but from an economic perspective, I think for a lot of communities throughout Northern Ontario, it's been a really big blow. A lot of mills have closed down. A lot of small contractors have been forced to shut down. And the figures are that there's been about a 30% decline in employment. I think it's been between 2000 and 2009. And I'd say that I've seen statistics that have been even higher than that. There's been 60 permanent or indefinite mill closures in the same period in Ontario. And stumpage payments, the impacts are felt in small communities, but the impacts are also felt from a provincial perspective, just in terms of the amount of stumpage payments that are being paid out to government, which are then reinvested in the economy and in society in many ways. So stumpage payments have been down 25% around between 2003 and 2009. And in the meantime, the government has been forced to spend a lot of money bolstering the forest industry through things like rebates on stumpage, low-interest loans programs for investment in infrastructure. There's electricity rebates for the pulp and paper industry. All of this type of stuff, also incurs a debt to society. I had a little bit of a look at population statistics as well, and it was interesting to see that in terms of demographics, when I looked at the boreal forest in my study, the two areas that had experienced the greatest population decline between 2000 and 2005 in the whole boreal forest were Newfoundland and Northern Ontario. So there's obviously something going on here that is maybe even a little more severe than in other parts of the boreal, including Quebec. The study that I did was on Quebec and Ontario. And then there's something that is, probably recognized by some of you who have affiliations with Lakehead, and also for me, who is a graduate of the Faculty of Forestry at University of Toronto, which is right on the verge of closing their doors. There's a direct impact being felt, and potentially with great repercussions for the future in terms of enrollments in forestry schools and so on. So I saw this little tidbit here on the website, one of the websites affiliated with the Faculty of Forestry at U of T, which was a survey of 65,000 graduating high school students. 6 chose forestry as their preferred discipline. I was a little bit surprised. I knew that enrollment was going down, but it's an indication that there's a need to kind of reinvent and start thinking about forestry education potentially in a new way in order to attract the labor pool that we're going to need in order to manage the forests for the future. So the second part of my presentation, I'm going to just go through the different policy ideas that I presented for a greener forest economy. I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail, but I'd be happy to answer more specific questions about any of these ideas after my presentation. So the first one was develop a political strategy for building a green forest economy. So this is the idea that in order to move ahead on having a real vision for a forest economy, whether it's in Ontario, Northern Ontario, or Canada, there's really a need to have the political will to do that. And so that means getting people together, making commitments, having people from different ministries within the government working together on a broader vision, setting specific targets for how you're going to achieve this greener forest economy, having meetings where you come back and you report on what you've done, working on collaborative initiatives, all this type of thing. It's not going to happen in a silo. It would really need to be something a little bit more broad-based. And I think that events like today, especially if there is time for talk and strategy and all that type of stuff, is a really nice step in that direction on a regional level. Implementing ecosystem-based management. There's not really consensus on what ecosystem-based management is, but there's lots of interesting initiatives in that direction at different scales going on already that I think can help inform better environmental policy. So, in the Great Bear Rainforest, they made a commitment about, I don't know, maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago now, to implement ecosystem-based management, and they're inviting scientists to think about this. They're working with the FSC standard to try to have a proper system in place to monitor whether they're moving in that direction. I think that the fundamental idea with ecosystem-based management is that you think about the environment first, and also the sort of socioeconomic variables as well, and then you set the harvesting requirements afterwards. So you really sort of look at the ecological carrying capacity as the first priority, and then you start to build all your activities around that. And there's lots of interesting ideas within ecosystem-based management around collaboration and around monitoring and around the integration of traditional Aboriginal knowledge and all sorts of stuff. It's a very broad concept, but I think it would have to be at the sort of center of any kind of a green strategy for the forest industry. Interestingly, Quebec actually just implemented a new law, a new forest law, kind of like the way you guys are moving towards here, or at least in their case they actually trashed the old one and implemented a new one. And one of the key principles is ecosystem-based management. So it'll be interesting to see how the government defines that. And the other thing that's really interesting in Quebec is that the government also took back management responsibility in that province. So it's not going to be the companies that are doing the planning anymore, it's going to be the government. So they've tasked themselves with something pretty ambitious. And the next one is diversify the tenure system. So I'm being from Quebec and reading up a little bit in Ontario, I can see that there is a move here to at least redefine the tenure system to some extent. I've had a chance to look at tenure systems in different provinces because I've been studying community forestry so much, and it's just an absolute fundamental in terms of diversifying the forest economy is diversifying the tenure system. You know, one of the statistics that came out of this Greenpeace study was the fact that 50% of Ontario's AAC, like all the wood that's cut, is allocated to 5 forest companies. So it's an extremely concentrated and consolidated industry that you guys have in Ontario. And you know, in order to allow smaller players to have access to tenure, to allow communities to have access to tenure, to allow companies that are interested in doing value-added processing to have access to tenure, access to wood, you need to diversify the tenure system. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. I saw one really interesting idea, which I think would help to kind of bolster this green economy idea, is allocate something like take back 10% of the wood and reallocate it to forest companies that are in partnership with companies that are doing value-added processing. So, you know, set requirements in there that really encourage secondary and tertiary processing of the wood within the region rather than, you know, shipping out the raw material. And the third one, provide incentives for green industries. So, you know, there's something that I read up about which is called ecological fiscal reform. And basically that idea is just to, if you have the right government in power, that there's all sorts of ideas, tax rebates, permits, direct spending, tax credits, all sorts of stuff like that that can be put in place which encourage the development of green industries. So I can just name a few examples: tax deductions for companies that acquire environmentally friendly equipment and technology, like light footprint harvesting methods, low impact road building, tax credits to help offset the costs associated with certification, taking a proportion of stumpage payments from companies who are harvesting and putting it towards rehabilitation activities or a conservation fund, supporting the development of environmentally friendly activities within parks and protected areas that are kind of valorizing for the local community that lives around the parks and the protected areas, supporting the non-timber forest products industry, ecotourism. There's really, it's kind of like what we were talking about this morning with the green energy. The opportunities are so great. It's just a question of taking reorienting our sort of policy framework towards in ways that are valorizing the green economy instead of just valorizing economic activity. End of story. There's also some interesting examples of that I've visited, like municipalities in Quebec, for example, that are trying to encourage their municipalities to buy local, and then they're also trying to set an example by, for example, a municipality is putting in place like a common heating system using biomass that heats the school, the church, and the municipal buildings. Like really small scale projects, but which kind of set an example in a way for how we can try to valorize forestry activity more within our own municipalities. Another one is provide transition funding for forest-dependent communities. So, communities are, in many cases, they have little diversity within them because they've been dependent on one large forestry employer for a long time. And they're often in remote areas where there's not that many options in terms of economic activity. So there's just no doubt that we need to provide support and capacity building to these forest-dependent communities and to Aboriginal communities as well. If you look at the demographics that I was talking about before, it's the Aboriginal communities are the only ones that have young populations that are really growing and exploding. And so, by investing in the future generations in terms of training in activities that are environmentally sustainable and which appeal to the interests of young people, just by this whole statistic I was saying around forestry schools and their enrollment, it's obvious that we need to think about what types of activities in the forest are appealing to young people and what they might be interested in doing, and it might not be traditional forestry jobs. Institute co-management with First Nations and collaborative arrangements with communities. You know, this is on the radar again of governments, and co-management is not a new idea, but there's not a lot of examples of co-management arrangements where, for example, First Nations are really empowered to have equal decision making. And so there's a lot of research out there that shows that, you know, it's a step in the right direction, but it's still somewhat of a frustrating exercise, because at the end of the day, it's the government that has the final decision making power. It's the government that sort of sets out the rules and the administrative processes within that, which are not necessarily well aligned with the way that First Nations would like to make decisions. And so there's a need to, you know, to bring communities and First Nations into the decision-making process in a more meaningful way. And it's been shown that that has great benefits in terms of conflict resolution, in terms of like having a more regional vision for forest management, in terms of creating new initiatives amongst people within a community because they're getting together in a new forum. There's a lot of really interesting advantages. And fundamentally, it's about empowering communities to be involved in forest management in their own areas, which I think is something that most people would agree is a really good thing. And I think this is the last one. Support non-timber forest sectors and environmental services. So there was an interesting study that came out. It's probably the most interesting thing that I saw in all the time that I did the research, which was that the non-timber forest sectors in the boreal forest already employ as many people as in logging. And half, so only logging, not all of the forest sector, but the same amount as in logging, and half of the entire forest sector. So we already have a fairly vibrant non-timber forest sector between, you know, different products and different activities and tour, you know, ecotourism and all this type of stuff. And that's without a lot of support, without a lot of regulatory mechanisms in place, without a lot of promotion. You know, it just shows the potential that the non-timber forest sectors have in the context of Northern Ontario or the boreal forest in general. And you know, I had a chance to see some really interesting projects. For example, there's one in Quebec where the community is doing kind of an intensive blueberry and forestry system. So they have these, you know, these hectares of area here, there in their municipality that are like strips of blueberry and strips of intensive forestry. You know, still on a very small scale, but they have actually good yields on both sides, both from a forestry perspective and a blueberry perspective. And then they, you know, because it's a community forest, they've even integrated like a common blueberry picking area where people from the community can come and pick blueberries free of charge. So it's, to me, it's just, it's the thing that I like so much about all this community forestry stuff is that it's got this kind of social economy aspect to it, which is that, you know, you're not just thinking about making money, you're also thinking about how you can create other benefits for local people that transcend just jobs. And so I think that another thing that's really interesting about non-timber forestry products is that they can employ different people from what the standard forest industry can employ. You know, you can be a single mom, or you can be somebody who's spends half the year on the land and half the year in the community. You can be somebody who only wants to work certain times of year. You can be less educated, and you can still potentially find work in the non-timber forestry sector that you probably wouldn't find in a more skilled environment like a mill, or, you know, maybe even driving some kind of a skidder or something like that. You know, it diversifies the types of people that can be involved in the forest economy. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
I've gone through, been there, done that, I've started to do what a lot of what you just talked about. I just want to make some comments. So, in regards to forestry, you talked about the education issue earlier on. Forestry is now a bad word. And that's why Lakehead changed their name from forestry to natural resources. When students hear the word forestry, it's associated with all sorts of things. Employment, degrading the bark, all sorts of things. So forestry is just outdated. With regard to community forestry, I've been working on that with others in several forums, trying to bring that into reality. I'm still involved with negotiations, but discussions with Ontario on the first round of forest tenure. The problem right now is that Ontario is not willing to embrace the concept of community forestry. They come up with a couple new models. They tried to vein to disguise one of the models as community forestry, but it's been rarely shown. I wish one of the cost conventionalists here who's liberal to community forestry, he totally shut down in our several months ago at a workshop regarding community forestry. But one of the problems in getting community forest going is that communities in Ontario, for the most part, and it's really Northern Ontario, the West and East communities aren't ready to embrace the concept of community forestry. Most of those communities still have a mill that's struggling. They don't want to jeopardize that mill. They don't want to rock the boat any more than it is. So they're not, and they're resisting the movement towards community forestry. Whereas if you look at the core center of Ontario, Funny Bay not being one of those communities, the most adapted communities are all in favor of community forestry in concept because their mills now are gone. If they're shut down, they don't see any more future. They have to come to grips. But again, none of the words that vocal in the current round, Ontario is not looking at really getting into community forestry right now again. And that's unfortunate because a lot of things you talk about at the end, like not doing forest forestry and those kind of things, the current models don't allow for the development of that because the industry controls access, they control everything. I've been involved several times trying to get non-timber forest products and value-added forest products to join. The industry, in the old niche markets, say, no, we're in charge, we're managing the forest for timber, pulp, whatever, for our roads, et cetera, you're not coming in. Even things like pick and slash for Christmas trees, blueberry picking, not allowed. So the huge change has to happen. And I think a lot of this is not going to happen until achieve community forestry.
Yeah, it's interesting, something that I sort of like, although it's still on a very small scale about Quebec and BC in terms of community forestry, is that it's not necessarily perceived as being in direct competition with the sort of larger scale crown land industrial model. Like there's enough forest out there that you can potentially allocate areas that are closer to communities that have more interest in terms of recreation and non-timber forest products and all that type of stuff, maybe not associated with the mill at all, to community organizations, and you can still have lots of crown land left for companies to have a SFL to start the mill back up and to do everything that they would also like to do. And so, it's unfortunate that the government isn't ready to just kind of experiment a little bit more with small scale tenures, because it's so interesting to see what will come out of that. And I think that those places are the most interesting sites to innovate on all this other stuff. But unless there's a land base on which to do it, it becomes pretty tricky. And so I wish that the government wouldn't necessarily see it as a one-size-fits-all, but more as like just a way to diversify the types of tenures that are out there, so that people who have different types of interests can still have access to forest.
My name is Irena. I live close to the development on the Hodr Avenue and the highway, and I've been watching the quote-unquote development over the past half year, and it breaks my heart to see how it infringes on the natural environment around there. There is a very beautiful park beside it, the so-called Trowbridge Park, Kinsman Park, which is adjacent to Centennial Park. Centennial Park is even closer to the highway, which has been widened, and the destruction of that natural environment is so enormous. It took me by surprise. I never expected there would be such destruction. And what we see is not even the whole story, because there is a huge destruction of the landscape behind the development, or quite farther away into the bush. And the destruction of the best sanctuary in Thunder Bay or in vicinity, the Trowbridge Kinsman Park, is extremely tragic. Not only that, it has stolen the homes of many, many animals, which are now moving to my backyard and looking at me and saying, how am I going to eat, how am I going to live now? You know, I see that terror in their faces. They are eating my garden because they lost their natural environment. I have never seen such creatures in my backyard before. And when I walked through the park recently, I couldn't believe that the sound of the highway now is throughout the whole park. That used to be a very favorite place for tourism. American people coming up and staying there in summer, during the summer. For local people to walk through and renew themselves. So I think this is extremely tragic. And I am thinking of the narrow-mindedness of the people that were planning, that implemented this development. And it's not finished yet. The sounds that we are hearing now at Tibishkogijig Park, Centennial Park, are going to be multiplied. I don't know how many folds when the whole program is finished. That is not even the end. So how? Yes. So I'm thinking that the terminology that has been used, natural resources, for one thing, is a terminology that we can continue to use when it leads us to believe that we are masters of the natural environment and that we can decide what we're going to do with it and follow through no matter how much it impacts the most beautiful parts of our what we have left. And it's not much because I'm a certain Greenpeace. I have learned that what we have here, the boreal forest is the last in the world. We have Greenpeace here recently, and I have learned this that the boreal forest is the last in the world. Are we going to continue to allow this to be happening over and over again? When is it going to stop? Do we need new terminology? Natural resources. That automatically looks like that's for us to take and exploit and rip out of, out of Mother Earth, whatever.
Thank you for your comments.
We will come back to some of those philosophical questions.
One of the concerns, so I agree with a lot of the points in the recommendations for change. One of the concerns I have is in the training of forest managers. In Ontario, we have the registered professional foresters who industry strongly informs what courses they take and what is being taught to the next generation of forest managers, and not only that, but who can then sign management plans. And that statistic of 6 students is very apparent, with the Faculty of Forestry here and other places. So I guess, how did the sort of education of the next generation factor into the study and the recommendations? And are you aware of other jurisdictions that have sort of taken a different approach to who has the authority to plan for public land?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know where things are going in terms of how planning is hooking up with, people's accreditation, but I would assume that it's going to come to loggerheads when there's just not enough professional foresters anymore to sign off on all the management plans. And I think that something that I thought was kind of interesting about some of these community forests and alternative types of initiatives is that they, because they were focusing on other, values, they were also drawing people with a different type of expertise. So there would be more room for people who have a degree in recreation or water quality or, facilitation and all these types of things. And so, the way that the policy is going, from what I know in Quebec anyway, these different concepts of decentralization and ecosystem-based management and and having more say in like local governance and all this type of stuff, it's going to create a demand for people with a different skill set. I think it's already happening. And so I think that most likely, you know, it's more, I think the challenge is more for those forestry schools to reinvent themselves appropriately so that they're going to be able to recruit people who are going to meet those new positions, more so than the fact that those positions aren't going to be created, because I think on the ground they're already being created. And it's kind of a catch-up time for the forestry schools who are realizing that they can't operate in the same way they've been operating for the past 100 years. You want to take one last question?
Yeah, Sarah, I just wondered, do you have any, you talked about the incentives for green industries, do you have any examples from other jurisdictions, like the things you kind of suggested, like tax credits or tax deductions? I know in BC with the community forest, they have the kickback of stumpage, but I don't know if that's specifically what you're talking about. I think they put that in.
Yeah, that's an example.
Sure.
Well, I think that there's even examples in Ontario that I would have to look back over my notes, but I think that there was even a sort of incentive for value-added, some type of incentive program for value-added companies here in Ontario. I don't have any specific examples in mind that I can. Do you have an example?
Well, there was a bioenergy conference here in the spring, sponsored by CRIBE, C-R-I-B-E, and they have a $25 million budget to work from to encourage value-added industries in the forest sector. And I think they will give you up to $2 million to projects that qualify. So there's an example.
Yeah. If you look, I meant to bring the report along with me, but it's really easily available online, and I'll write the name of the report down somewhere so people can write it down if they want. And there's quite a few more specific examples listed in there with references.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Dr. Luc Duchesne. Luc holds a PhD in plant biochemistry from the University of Guelph, an MSc in Forest Sciences from the University of Toronto, and a BSc in Forest Engineering from Laval. Luc brings a unique combination of scientific and technical expertise combined with business experience, including managing companies in biocarbons, bioproducts, and biodiesel technologies, as well as research and development. He is also director of a public venture in solar and wind development, and he has authored or co-authored 85 peer-reviewed science articles, book chapters, or books. That's very impressive to the graduate students out there, by the way. Welcome, Luc.
I forgot most of that stuff anyway. This is going to be a little different. I caution you. You might want to fasten your seatbelt. Used to be a scientist, did the academic thing, it was fun. Did the government research thing, it was fun. And then one day I said, all this stuff, this non-timber forest products, this bioenergy, this biomass, is there a way we can make money from it? And that sent me into a tailspin. And I was recruited into the private sector 10 years ago to do exactly that. And so speaking to you today, I represent probably 15,000 shareholders from 4 different public companies that do solar. We also do energy conservation. That's a different company that's called Grid Cloud Solutions. In fact, we have established at one point that there's a whole lot of nice technologies that could be inserted into the bioeconomy, into conservation that inventors and entrepreneurs do not know how to take to market, and we have a company that only does take these technologies to market because people just don't know how to do it. We actually have a company that manages credits for entrepreneurs in this kind of undertaking as well. So, and then the biocarbon venture. In case you're about to fall asleep, I'll tell you what I'll tell you over the next 6 hours in 30 seconds, so then you know. The carbon economy in Ontario has pretty well been killed by the current political context, and I'm referring to the current election campaign where we're told, well, you know, we're going to kill the Green Energy Act, and because of that, no one's moving as far as carbon. I'll explain that to you for the next few slides. Having said that, generating value from carbon, from forest, is immensely complicated. And I'm not saying 1,000 steps to be facetious, I'm telling you, it is complicated. Carbon as a currency is a critical issue. There's actual value in carbon itself, and it's based on a number of premises that we must acknowledge as a group. First, it starts with emitters emit greenhouse gases as they produce goods and services for consumers. So we're going to make whatever, so this is going to leave carbon in the atmosphere. And in the past, we grew up, all of us, going to university thinking, well, if you pollute and you have chimney stacks that are high enough, it will get diluted, and it doesn't matter. That's how the chimneys in Sudbury are so tall. Then eventually it caught up with us. We said, oh, look at that, we screwed up the environment, we're going to do something else. Well, that's the paradigm, right? And sorry, that wasn't technical terms. We messed up the environment. So, and the basic hypothesis, which is disputed by a number of people, is the global dynamics has been affected by us having diluted the environment qualities. In finances and in economics, we speak now of internalizing the cost of pollution, and I'll explain that a little later on. Essentially, if you are buying a car and that car is emitted 10 tons of carbon, in order to get that car to you, you have to pay for that carbon, because if you don't, somebody else will have to pay for it at one point. And this is the carbon trading issue, the cap and trade issue. It hinges on this very concept. In fact, the political debate as to whether or not we should have FIT or no FIT in Ontario based on the Green Energy Act also is based on the internalization of pollution costs. If you read the newspaper, every now and then you get the financial market saying to you that this perhaps up to $3, $4, $5 trillion worth of carbon trading year in and year out, if it is implemented appropriately. But it isn't, and I'm not telling you that that we are close to doing this. However, be aware that there are jurisdictions in this country and in North America where carbon trading is taking place. And it's taking place in a way that's completely unexpected. Just to make your life complicated, Alberta has a wonderful carbon system. If you live in Alberta and you have a development in oil sands, you have to pay carbon taxes. The government says to you, if you emit above this level, you'll have to pay $15 a ton that you emit, and you have the choice between paying the fine. It's not really a fine, it goes into an environmental fund, or actually buying an offset, as in plant trees somewhere, or go to a farmer and have that farmer manage her carbon emissions from the land so that you reduce the net amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Alberta has that. California has that too. Through the Western Climate Initiatives, there's a system in British Columbia, and in Ontario, guess what, folks, we have nothing, which for me as a businessman is causing a tremendous amount of trouble. Let's not go into the political debate yet. Let's talk about how we generate carbon currency. It's okay to say there's carbon somewhere, but it is a hard exercise to go from the concept of carbon to an actual currency that can be traded between us. Kyoto, just the Kyoto Protocol in Europe, which is supported by 100+ countries, leads to trading of carbon currencies in the order of $125 billion a year. So there's a significant amount of carbon that's being traded there. And in North America, where we have a voluntary system, we're looking to roughly $750,000 a year. So large disparity between the two sets of jurisdictions. What's carbon trading? So the government says to you, you are an emitter, and you notice I'm not using the word polluter because it displeases people in the financial market when you use that. Let's say you are a large emitter. The government says to you, you must reduce your emission level. You have the choice between redoing your technologies, so you're using less fossil fuels, or planting trees somewhere, so you create carbon offsets, or reducing your production level, simply just producing less stuff. And in the current economic paradigm, you do not stop producing because of the taxes. You find the most cost-effective solution to do it. And if it's least expensive to plant trees, you go for the trees. Now, it's very cleverly done. You don't have to plant the trees yourself. You can go see Sara. And Sara, you're going to set up a community forest. You're going to accrue some carbon from me. And we're going to use a third-party accountant kind of person to verify that you're actually growing the carbon from me. And then we've done it. We've actually done a carbon trading system. To do it, you need a few other things, and I'll explain that later on. Where am I? Okay. Now, if you really want to have a good time learning about cap and trade, you got to read this. You got to go to YouTube on this link here, and it's the funniest thing you will ever see in your life. It's also tagged to The Story of Stuff, which explains. I see some nods in the room, so you got to read this because it is really fun, and it's sarcastic too. So let's talk about the carbon value chain. That was I introduced that to you, Sara, a little earlier. So it goes like this. We have to reduce our net atmospheric carbon emission, and this is almost like an accountant talking to you here. We have an amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and we say, we gotta find a way to reduce the speed at which we put more carbon in the atmosphere. We're not talking about reducing what's there. We're talking about reducing the rate of accretion in the atmosphere. That's number one. We have the choice. We can increase biological sequestration. So we plant trees is the metaphor for this. We can increase carbon storage. So in Alberta, there's all kinds of subsidies that have been given to people to find ways to suck carbon out of the air and pump it in the ground so that it's there under pressure, and it'll be there for the next 5,000 million years. I personally don't believe in these technologies. That's the bias I'm passing you to here. I think it creates a false economy. It essentially says to someone, it's okay if you pollute, and it's okay for us if we're not accountable for this mechanism. We simply will catch up with this when the carbon comes out of the earth in 20,000 years. I think there's a flaw to this. Let's go to point number two. We have, in order to have a true carbon economy, you need a willingness or a need to buy carbon offsets. If you do not have that need, you might as well not think about it. And this is, with the current political climate, this is exactly where we are. And in my view, it's a missed opportunity. Typically, today in North America, people will buy carbon offsets because they are compelled. In California, if you are a large emitter, you have to buy carbon offsets. Or reduce your emissions, again, we've had this discussion, or you do it voluntarily because of the fact that you want to look good. TD, for example, TD Dominion, buys carbon offset to reduce its footprint. You fly Air Canada, you can actually buy some carbon offsets which are associated with the development of carbon elsewhere in Canada. I'm not speaking of those developers. I'm simply telling you, and I'm not endorsing those concepts. I'm just telling you that it does exist. A third part of offsets is you cannot go to someone and say, buy my carbon offsets. It doesn't exactly work like this. You need to actually create a currency. You need to go from a ton of something in the bush to a piece of paper that has actual legal value, and that is an extremely complex process in the carbon value chain. Past that, you can trade offsets, and finally you have to retire offsets, and this is when it gets to be really interesting. Remember, I started this by saying we are doing carbon trading because we want to reduce emissions. So someone's going to grow trees for you, and these trees will be turned into a piece of paper. No, let me rephrase this. The growth of these trees will be turned into a piece of paper that says you have carbon offsets. Then you're going to go transact on those carbon offsets, And when that person buys them, she will buy them to reduce emissions. So there's got to be a negative at one point. So you actually get to the point where that piece of paper is ripped apart and says, okay, we've reduced emissions now. Is this sufficiently complicated and messy? Let's make it more complicated. Where am I? Kyoto Protocol, there's a typo. It's been ratified by 100+ countries. The Kyoto Protocol has been in effect for a number of years. It's the most comprehensive environmental agreement, global environmental agreement we've seen in history. I'm making a point here that Canada and USA and the US are not signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. Go ahead, sir.
Actually, Canada is a signatory.
They haven't ratified it. They haven't ratified it. So thank you for that point. And this has been.
We haven't done anything about it, but
there's two levels. Okay, let's carry on so we don't get confused. The problem with Kyoto, when I told you there's $125 billion a year with the Kyoto credits trading, is you cannot grow trees in Thunder Bay and sell them on the European market for carbon because we haven't ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So we have agreed to be put in our own little bubble with the United States. And this is based on for the principle that if we start charging a large carbon tax, associated with the activities we do carry out in Canada, we might mess up with our economy. Okay, now let me talk about the methodology for the carbon. One little detour. Carbon values, carbon can be traded in two ways. You can trade it on the market, just like a stock, or you can transact business to business. Sarah, you want to buy a ton of carbon? I'll sell it to you for market value, $15. Or if you're really, really, really hungry, I'll sell it to you for $20. So there's two ways you can transact carbon. And because of that, the price of carbon varies. There's quite a lot of variance in it. And I'll wrap this up when I speak later on about how it's organized. There's 4 ways you can generate carbon from forest. And these 4 ways depend largely on what radio stations you listen to. And I'm saying this to draw your attention on the fact that there's different methodologies that are used to determine what amount of carbon is eligible for trading. This is 2 days worth of discussions. If I were to explain it in 30 seconds, I would say it's not all activities that lead to the same amount of recognizable carbon. And the bottom of the list, the least credible carbon is this. We say, all right, folks, we're going to put a fence around 100,000 hectares of forest, and because we're putting a fence here, we are doing conservation, and every ounce of carbon on that piece of land is going to turn into a carbon credit. If you say that, and there's actually a methodology for this kind of stuff, you have a carbon. You do not actually create additionality. I'll explain additionality if you look at number 1 on that list. If we say, actually the example of the park a little earlier. So there's 1,000 hectares of land beside your house, and there's a development that's planned on it. We're going to clear cut the whole thing. We're going to remove all the stump. We're going to pave it, and we're going to have a shopping mall. So, and assuming there's 200 tons per hectare, 200 tons per carbon per hectare, the avoidance of removing these trees will give us or reduce emissions by 2,000 tons of carbon. So we said there's a development that's planned. We're not going to develop it. We are not going to emit that carbon. We're saving 2,000 tons of emissions. That is creditable. So there's methodologies you can use to actually monitor, organize this. And this gives you carbon credits. Again, this is in comparison to the number 4 on my list here, which shows if you put a fence around a forest, it is you could potentially generate carbon credits, and depending on the filter you use, you get different amounts of carbon. And those filters are essentially methodologies that are approved by different bodies that are independent of governments. I'm not saying this to confuse you. I'm saying this so you know it's not it's really 1,000 steps. What's the value of performance? And because of that, because of those 4 factors I've given you a little earlier, there are significant differences in the value of the carbon that's being traded. That which was traded on the Chicago Stock Exchange, which is now, this activity is now ceased, was worth $15 a ton. And if you were trading, if Sara and I were trading high value carbon from avoided deforestation, the golf course example, we'd be transacting at $6 to $8 a piece. So there's a large variance in what can and is transacted right now. Okay, how do you do this? How do you turn a forest into carbon offsets, knowing that there are all kinds of limitations? First of all, you have to create something that's called a project design document. I'm not going to go through the exhaustive list, but I've created my slides so that it can be used by someone to then do research past the presentation. A project design document is like the roadmap which will permit a third party, like Peter, for example, to actually look at where I say there is carbon, and he to go look at that piece of land and figure out my methodology so he can say, hey, yeah, I've looked at this thing. There's really 100,000 tons of carbon on that piece of land. It makes sense. So when Sara buys the carbon from me, she can rely on Peter for having done a good job. And so there's third-party verification in carbon trading. To get the third-party verification, I need a good roadmap. It's called a project design document. There is, in North America right now, there's 5 different types of methodologies you can use to determine whether the quality of your carbon credit. And these methodologies have been created by well-intentioned people meeting the needs of their jurisdictions. And the emerging methodologies right now comes from California under the Climate Action Reserve. And to make it that much more interesting, California, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, and 6 other states in the US joined into a group that's called the Western Climate Initiative. And they said, you know what, you the federal governments, I'm not going to use profane language. We are going to set up our own policies. We're going to reduce our emissions, and we're going to do economic trade between ourselves so that we do not alter our economies. We're going to call ourselves the Western Climate Initiatives, and we're going to use our own methodologies to determine carbon. They've actually done that, and California, of that group, is the most advanced. As of last December, they were the emitters were compelled to actually reduce their emissions. British Columbia, and if you go back to one of the slides I had earlier, has its own methodology for carbon from forest, and Ontario doesn't have its methodology yet. And I'm not saying this to be facetious. The elections have put a complete dead stop on carbon issues in Ontario. Okay, now let's talk about price point. It's very easy to say you have a piece of forest from which you can generate carbon, but remember I said I was going to hire Peter to determine that my carbon is really good carbon. And this is caused by the fact that a forest has got a whole bunch of trees, and it's technically, physically, economically impossible to measure every tree in the forest to determine where your carbon is. So you have to make statistical assumptions. And those statistical assumptions are balanced against your price point. So I tell you right off the bat, to meet the requirements of the Climate Action Reserve, your cost is roughly $2 to $3 a ton for the carbon. So having said that, you remember a little earlier I said Chicago Stock Exchange carbon trading at 15 cents a ton? You trade it at 15 cents a ton, and it costs you $2 to $3 to develop it. You are in trouble. to actually get to your price point, you need legislations that actually help you fix the benchmark or benchmark the cost of carbon, and I'll get to that a little earlier. The emitter's conundrum. Emitter again is synonymous with polluter. So you're sitting here and you have a power plant, and you are compelled to you know that the legislations come in to whack you in the head at one point. If you consider forest as a source of carbon offsets, here's your problem. First of all, you do not know that the carbon generated from forest is permanent. A new concept I'm including here. It goes like this. We say collectively we own a forest as a co-op. We own 100 hectares of land. And we say we're not going to cut trees here, and we're going to do all kinds of nice things to make trees grow faster. Right? It's a good idea. Trees will grow at 3 tons per hectare per year, and it's fabulous growth. It's great. We're going to find a way to transact this carbon into an emitter. Our problem is this. The buyer is going to say to us, look, if I'm using the Kyoto standards, you need to prove to me that the carbon you're selling me is still going to be there in 100 years. What do you mean? The trees you're selling me, are they going to be there in 100 years? Well, I don't know. Okay, do statistics. Demonstrate to me that I am not wasting my money. And that's one of the biggest problems in carbon credits from forest. It's called many things, one of which is the permanency of carbon credits. Compare this to other activities which lead to permanent carbon offsets. It goes like this. We have a plant that burns 1,000 tons of coal a year to do gizmos, whatever gizmos, tables. And we say, you know what? We're going to change our technology. We're going to reduce our emissions to by using only 500 tons of coal for the same output. And that differential will give you carbon offsets. Those carbon offsets are actually permanent because you've reduced emissions for good, as compared to trees growing in the bush. When you know when insects would come, you know forest fire will come, natural succession is going to come, trees will die and release the carbon that they have stored. So it makes your life immensely complicated. So ultimately what we get in a non-legislated environment like Ontario, emitters say, okay, I know I don't have to transact, I'm going to watch, I'm going to figure out what the carbon models are, and when the government says to me, you got to pay for emissions, I'll pay for them, otherwise I'm not going to touch it because it's too complicated. The emitters aren't alone, the landowners, and I'm assuming some of you are landowners here, you're faced with similar problems. So someone says to you, I'm going to buy, Sarah, I'm going to buy your carbon. I know you have 100 hectares, I'm not thinking of you, sorry. But I know you have 100 hectares of land. I want to buy your carbon. And you're going to say, oh, I want to sell my carbon. I want to make money. But you also know that if you sold the trees, you would make money from it. And you also know that if the market goes belly up, you're not going to make money from the carbon. So in a period of uncertainty, and this is where we are now in Ontario, it is very hard for landowners to decide which way they're going to swing. Are they going to transact carbon, or are they going to cut trees? And it's a very tough decision. Now, in an environment where forestry is not doing well, as we heard a little earlier, it's an easy decision to sit. But in an environment where forestry is doing well, your carbon value has to be solid in order to outrank that of the timber value. There's a third group of people who are involved in carbon in the carbon value chain, and it's developers. All that stuff I have told you, for you to understand this as landowners, or for you to understand it as emitters, will take you a massive amount of time. So there's a third group of people who are called developers, people like me who say, hey, don't worry about it. I will find a way to take your forest and turn it into carbon credits in a way that respects the legislation. That's a third group of people involved in the value chain. The problem is this. Look at this. You remember I spoke of statistics a little earlier? I said you cannot measure every tree in a forest, and the less trees the more tree you measure, the more certain you are of the amount of carbon you have in your forest. But it is too expensive to measure every single stick of wood. So you have to find a way where you're making money and you're not spending too much money. And these are the criteria which we're dealing with. A sampling error is the error on your sampling. So you measure a tree, you measure one tree out of 10, now let's do, you measure one tree out of 20, and you say, you know what, I have 10 tons of carbon here, and I'm sure plus or minus 10%. That's the 10% sampling error. That error has value in the carbon trading. The greater the error, or the lesser the error, the better the carbon value, and the greater the error, the more you're screwed. So ultimately, in the methodologies that are in place now, if your error is 20%, if you're 20% out on your volume measurement, your carbon has absolutely no value. And that's very stringent. And so there's a technical issue here, and it's part of our conundrum, because if there's no value that's fixed to carbon, if it's free market, then it's not worth trading unless it goes to the actual value. Oh, let's go to this slide, unless you go to the actual value. So I have two last slides to summarize. One is, let's predict what the future of carbon trading is going to be in Northern Ontario. I think we in the North provide the people of the South with some services, some goods and services that need to be accounted for. We provide carbon dioxide removal. So you folks in Toronto, when you drive your pickup trucks, you're not contemplating the fact that our trees are growing. I'm picking on you here. That our trees in the north are, good for you. Our trees in the north are growing. And I'm being facetious, but this is the very basic principle of carbon trading. We provide wildlife habitat. We provide the South with recreational activities, and you got to pay for that stuff, and you will pay it by creating a carbon tax, which is actually very easy to implement as opposed to everything else. Okay, now this is when it gets to be interesting. I became interested in all this bioeconomy thing because I wanted to change the world, and I found that to do it, I had to speak the language of the financiers. I had to sit in the boardroom and understand what it is that these folks wanted to see so I can change the system from within. You know, if we look at the effect of carbon taxes, having in mind that I tend to have a social democrat agenda, it's not a political statement. If we really want consumers to change, to make changes in their choice, we have to provide them with the ability to know what it is that they're buying. So you're buying the choice between a table from China or a table from Northern Ontario. What's the carbon footprint? What's the comparative carbon footprint of it? We're back to the internalization of production of pollution cost. We've got to make sure that emitters are accountable for that which they emit. And I highly recommend you go to the story of cap and trade. You could work in a place in China and have absolutely no environmental accountability for what you do, so pollute the environment, and we know because of the dilution phenomenon that we'll pay for it eventually. You could work in China and be able to sell goods here that are cheaper than goods that are manufactured here under very high stringent environmental regulations. So we got to make the people who pollute somewhere else pay for that difference between us, so to even the playing field. It's a necessity. I think the basic principle is whether we agree to pay immediately for the cost of goods or services or we defer them. And it goes like this. And my best example for this is the example of the war in Iraq. The United States and the Western Alliance is fighting the war in Iraq because presumably we want to save democracy, but we happen to be able to protect 4 million barrels of oil production capacity per day. To do this, it costs us $2 million a day, So you do the math, we're actually subsidizing oil at $50 a barrel. So it's a subsidy. So you're waiving, you're telling me, oh, sorry, okay.
Maybe that was subconscious.
I'm almost done. I'm almost. So we actually do a cost deferral by subsidizing the oil industry by supporting war in Iraq. When we say we do not pay for our pollution costs, we're actually doing exactly the same thing with deferring costs. And when catastrophic climatic events come, we actually are starting to pay the impact of this. We know the general climate model for this part of the world, not Western Ontario, in 100 years under climate change will lead to very severe wildfire. In fact, it's very possible you'll turn to prairie grassland. You'll pay for this dearly. You're not paying for it now, but you will pay it when wildfires come more abundant and more with higher fire severity in the future. That's an example. Okay, so let's conclude with this. This is the effect of a carbon tax. So ethical consumers will currently have very little chance of knowing where the carbon footprint of what they have. So if we have a carbon tax that is indexed to the actual carbon contribution of each goods and services we buy, we will know. So you don't know if driving 250 kilometers or flying 250 kilometers has got the same carbon footprint. If you pay the tax, you will know. It will be indexed. Perhaps let's give you the example of the bread. You know, if we know that here that the emissions of a loaf of bread, and we embed this within the cost of a loaf of bread, we will actually be able to make choices that are decent as far as environmental concerns are concerned, as far as the environment is concerned. Thank you for your attention. I'd like to take the next 7 hours to explain all that stuff now.
Yeah, I can take questions. I think it's more of a comment, but maybe it'll lead to a question. It's a short one. I really believe in carbon taxes, but only if a big percentage of them go to direct dividends to consumers across the landscape on a per capita basis. So therefore, if you live in a big house and drive a Hummer, you'll get hammered. And if you ride a bike and turn off lights and do other good things, you'll make money on the deal. And I would implement those carbon taxes at the lowest possible level, at the wellhead or at the coal mine or whatever, so that our exports, so that the Yankees can help us pay for our infrastructure and conservation and our direct subsidies to our citizens. And Luke, I'm really nervous about carbon trading. I'm still thinking about it. My party tells me to be in favor of carbon trading and be against carbon taxes because that was a liberal and a green idea. But I have trouble going there. It just seems too complicated, and it just seems to me that the ones that'll make money on it are the markets, the stockbrokers, the share brokers, and why make it so simple when we could just do it with carbon taxes?
I agree with you. I think a carbon tax is the best way to do it. Wellhead carbon tax, I think we would miss a whole lot of value added. Along the value chain, there's a whole lot of carbon that is added to fossil fuels, for example. We know that for 1 ton of petrodiesel that we burn, there's 2 tons of carbon that's been emitted because there's a whole amount of heat that's used in the in the cracking of crude oil. So we got to find a way to capture the carbon emissions along the value chain. Carbon trading is created to permit is a mechanism created to permit emitters to be creative in the way they meet their obligations, and this is not a conspiracy. This is a financial mechanism. So, Sarah, you're producing 20,000 tons a year, and by law you have to reduce by 5,000 tons. So you're stuck, right? And you know your technology cost is going to be $100 a ton. I'm speculating off the top of my head. So either you go bankrupt, and then, you know, from a political perspective, you turn companies into bankruptcy, you get whacked in the head. So I have to give you a way out. And that way out is the ability for you to plant trees somewhere. And in between, there's got to be some leeway for the transaction of it. And that's where carbon trading takes place. So the problem with carbon trading is the way we define carbon units or carbon currency has to be defined very, 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 very precisely. If we do it well and we're careful and we understand why we're doing this, I think we can do it. California is doing it. It's happening in Europe. The problem with Europe is there's been all kinds of little gimmicks, people taking advantage of the equivalent of HST, not the HST. You know, we're creating a new currency, and we're comparing this to the US dollars or our currency, which has been in place for 150 years. So I expect there's going to be hiccups along the way. But we got to do it. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that we must do it.
Two questions for you. You might have answered them part of the answers are actually going along. But my first one is on the developer side. You mentioned that if a developer's involved, doesn't do it, you get a credit. What's to stop anybody from saying, I'm going to put a wall up there, and then 3 months later say, never mind, carbon credit. And then, if I take that down the line, let's say 10 years later, someone's saying, I'm going to put a wall, and I don't do it, they sell the land.
You're committed. The question is, can you, I'll paraphrase your question, you know, it goes like this. You can say, I'm going to put a fence around this piece of property and I'll transact the carbon, right? But you can transact the carbon year after year. That's number one. And you remember I used the Peter example, you need the third party verification. Peter's got to go every year to check that my carbon's there. And if it's not there, you're buggered.
You pay back.
Actually, there's a mechanism in carbon trading that forces you to keep carbon in reserve. So let's say I have 1 million tons today, and it's from forest, and my forest danger is very high, and the danger of someone doing poaching logs on my property is very high. The methodology is going to compel me not to trade 20% of my carbon every year. And that carbon goes into a pool, which is just like an insurance policy. So if things get screwed up along the way, I draw out from the pool. So there are clever people who worked out those mechanisms. The issue, though, and this is a very good point, is one of permanence. If you say I am transacting a ton of carbon, it's got to be there in 100 years. If it's not there, then we get troubles.
In regards to the Bush Tim Harvey. M&R, I've been out of touch with this for a long while. M&R some years ago told me that when it comes down to Tim Harvey, doing nothing is not acceptable. You can't get credit from doing nothing.
Correct. Okay, let me explain that. That's a 2-hour answer, but I'll summarize in 30 seconds. When you do carbon trading from forest, carbon accretion from forest, it has to go outside the standing legislation. If the government says to you, you cut a tree, you got to plant a tree. You cannot count that planting activity as accruing carbon. If you come in behind the tree and you put mycorrhizal fungi, you put little fungi that makes them grow faster, and the trees grow 10% faster every year, that 10% is a carbon credit. But in whatever is legislated, whatever you're forced to do by law, you cannot count as a carbon credit.
The last part of my question is going to be, in the case of, say, Maharsnet, and I could look at it as a debate, who owns the carbon credits? I mean, technically, if we're talking, I'm not talking about land, but if you're talking about land, technically, a company does not own that trees until they cut them down and theoretically they stumpage. The issue I heard from the government on that is that the industry is not really eligible to get carbon credits because they don't really own the bush.
No. It's not that. Sorry, I don't mean to dispute you in public, but I want to speed up this thing. the value chain is a goofy thing. The landowner owns the carbon credit, or if I sell you, and I'll give you another example, if I sell you a ton of biodiesel, which I do in Sault Ste. Marie, there's a carbon credit attached to it, but you as the consumer, you own that ton of carbon credit. Now, I can transact with you and say, I'm selling you a ton of biodiesel, but by the way, you gotta give me the carbon credits. Or, when the co-op entered into an agreement with the OPA, there's a paragraph in the contract that said the environmental benefit belongs to the OPA. So they own the carbon credits, the OPA. So there's a way you can actually capture it. The landowner owns the credit.
Even if they don't necessarily own the trees. In various cases, the part land, and there's plenty of people on the day where landowners does not own the trees. They may not know it, but they may not own the trees on their property.
Let's not go into exceptions,
No,
okay?
but
The principle is whoever owns the trees. There's the gentleman raising his hand.
I just wanted to know what, in your opinion, is the effectiveness from the consumer level of people like myself, when you use your vehicle all month and you track your mileage per month and then run that through Planet Air or some other carbon offset place, and you pay, and so you have a $10 or $15 carbon tax, self-imposed carbon tax per month. And then that you can choose which projects you want to support in third world countries or wherever. Now, how effective is that at the consumer level for someone who wants to act a little bit more responsibly?
At the household level, it's effective. Mm-hmm. At the broadcast consumer level, it isn't. And it goes like this. Environmental decisions are made at Walmart at 10:15 on Saturday morning, and they're made on price point. People like to consume. They will find the cheapest product there is, and they need to be forced to actually pay for the taxes. So what you're describing is early adopters, and early adopters in societies are very, very, very small amount. They contribute very little to the statistical distribution. So I'm back to we got to find the policies. We got to push it. We're going to be brutal about this. Sir?
Sorry. We only have 15 minutes left for Clifford's talk and questions, so I wanted to move on with that. It's obviously a really complicated topic, and if there's lots of questions, maybe we can talk more about it over lunch, but we're going to move on now. Anyways, thank you, Luke, for that talk. It was very good. Our next speaker is Clifford Tibishkogijig. Pronounced that very close. Clifford is a longtime resident of the White Sand First Nation. He was born and raised there. He became chief in 1995 at the young age of 27, actually the youngest chief in Northwestern Ontario ever elected. Does that stand true still, Clifford?
I believe.
Clifford served his community as chief for 4 consecutive 2-year terms. He is currently the Economic Development Officer for White Sand. He will be speaking about the White Sand Community Sustainability Initiative that his community has spearheaded, a community-based forestry initiative for the Armstrong Forest, which roughly coincides with White Sands First Nations traditional territory. The initiative proposes that the communities assume full responsibility for all forest management that takes place on the White Sands traditional land base. So, welcome, Clifford.
Thank you. If that carbon discussion didn't put you to sleep, well, hopefully my presentation will wake you up. But it's very interesting to listen to some of the presentations before and listen to some of the questions that are being asked. And I'm sitting back and wondering, where can I be most effective in terms of developing an understanding in building a green economy? As a First Nation member of the White Sand First Nation, I must admit that if there's anybody in this room who has strong ties to the land in which we want to protect, it's the people that are living on the land. But in recognizing that as a First Nation society, we have a responsibility in protecting this environment, we have many conundrums, as somebody outlined, in terms of how we achieve that perspective on protecting the environment. So not to put you to sleep and give you the history of our strong ties to the land, I'll sort of expedite that thought to where we are today. Interestingly enough, and I'll get to my presentation very shortly. I know it's a lengthy one and I'll go as fast as I can, so bear with me. But I think it's really important to note that it's important to understand some of the challenges we face as a First Nation in ensuring that our voices are heard. And I'd like to comment that the lady made here about the loss of a habitat for some animals and how sincere she felt in the need to help those animals for the loss of the habitat that they've lost. The same likely scenario could be used for some of the First Nation people who are being impacted currently, not only in Canada but worldwide, in terms of the destruction of their traditional homelands. And White-Sand First Nation, White-Sand First Nation finds itself at a pivotal point in their society in terms of how they want to move forward. And I think it's really, somebody deemed it up here, the ideal perfect storm in the need to get things right in terms of how do we achieve a balanced perspective on creating a strong, sustainable economy, but at the same time protect the environment. I don't know if this is the appropriate time to, or if it's a good or a bad time to have this discussion on creating a green economy. There's so many interpretations of how we move ahead on this, but given the fact that there's an election, it seems that we could be those people running those treadmills and not getting anywhere real fast. Because what I heard here this morning so far are some really interesting comments, and there's some very bright people in this room that I think can spearhead this initiative. But if the political will isn't there, then we're going to be a long time waiting in achieving our common objective. So with that, I'd like to proceed with my presentation. And I must apologize, when I was asked to put a presentation together, we did this in very short order. So, but when I said that in short order, I didn't think it was going to be as long as it is, because I only read it at 7 o'clock this morning. So bear with me. Our project is the White-Sand First Nation Community Sustainability Initiative, CSI White-Sand. Green Economy Forum for Northern Ontario. What did I do?
Nope.
Okay, thank you. I believe now that it's moose hunting season, I don't know if this guy is still running around. About White-Sand. White-Sand First Nation has a population of 1,100 people that live on and off reserve, which is a community based out of 240 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. White-Sand is adjacent to the community of Armstrong, north of Thunder Bay. White-Sand First Nation and Armstrong are powered by a diesel powering generating station. White-Sand is situated in the Armstrong Forest and a number of area parks. The community is served by chief and council that are elected for 2 years. And when you're talking about provincial election, we're also going into election mode tomorrow. Yes, I'd rather be somewhere else, campaigning. For what, I don't know. White-Sand First Nation is born in the distinctive of settlements in and around the CN line. And I think it's important to note also here with this slide, or this part of the presentation, is that White-Sand First Nation was originally a community on the northwestern shore of Lake Nipigon, which was initially impacted by hydro development in the 20s and the 1940s, which the community was displaced, only to come to existence again in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So there's a displacement factor of almost 60 to 70 years there before we came back to form the community of White Sand.
Excuse me, sir. I wonder if the microphone can be adjusted so we don't have this echo here.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I won't speak too close to it, and I'll. Oh, put that. Sorry.
Oh.
I'll just hang out by the computer. I promise I won't do that again. So this is giving you a general idea where we're situated. We consider ourselves a community in ground zero in terms of developing a green economy. Creating a path forward. How can we achieve a balance between protecting the environment and creating an economic and resource development? We struggled with this for many years, and many times we find that some of the major obstacles are some of the obstacles that we continue to talk about today. White Sand, like I said, just like any other First Nation here in Northwestern Ontario, will indicate to you that they're the original stewards of the land. However, that doesn't carry well with government and society in terms of interpreting who has the right to manage those resources. And you see a lot of that today, especially with the potential development of the Ring of Fire. First Nations are positioning themselves to say, you know what, before you come and destroy our backyard, we want to become a partner in developing those resources. But I think what's missing, though, in terms of trying to establish that partnership in creating a sustainable economy, is the need to ensure that everybody understands what is it that we're trying to protect and what is it that we're trying to develop. And First Nations find themselves at like I said, you're either in or you're either out in terms of how you move forward on creating sustainable development. And like I said, White Sand is almost on the center of that. And somebody mentioned this morning about the creation of the Green Energy Act. There's one more piece of act that was recently developed, is the Far North Act. And the one question that we asked in terms of those two pieces of legislation, and right now we're currently engaging the provincial government in terms of developing an understanding and developing a balanced approach on resource development and sustainability. And I guess it was asked that one of our meetings is that can somebody within the provincial bureaucracy give us a balanced perspective in how we're going to do that? And the room went silent. So now we're at a point of engaging the provincial government in terms of developing that process. And it's quite exciting. Unfortunately, I'm not able to divulge where we're at entirely right now, in fear because of the election that's about to happen. So we're now at a stage where we ask, what role will the federal and provincial governments play? Sorry if I'm slurring, that's because I am. It's lunchtime. So really, I think White Sand First Nation finds itself in a very strategic position to really seriously ask that question and demand answers. Because what needs to happen very quickly, and I think there's a movement that's taking place at all levels in how we create what is being deemed the green economy. The point that I really want to make with the third one here is, how will municipalities and area First Nations be involved? I sort of put that the way it is right now, because really what First Nations are asking at this point, we want equal participation at the provincial and federal level. And it seems that when it comes to developing policy legislation, First Nation people are considered secondary. We're an afterthought. But really, I think First Nation people should be first and foremost at the forefront in developing legislation and policy and how those lands are going to be managed. Building a green economy. Who are the key partners? What role do First Nations play? And this is where we're currently at right now in debating this issue with different levels of the provincial government. Is First Nation people just mere stakeholders? Are we just a party of interest? Or are we considered members of the general public? And really, we're really scrambling now to try to really define what role the First Nations potentially play in developing this partnership and managing those resources. The other one is how will the partnership be established? Again, like I said earlier, although I could boast about it, I guess, I think White Sand First Nation can pride itself in trying to create a path in how we achieve that balance between sustainable development and protecting the environment, but at the same time creating resource development. What key goals and objectives of the partnership and what timeline will be established? Well, just when we asked this question, and long after we defined our goals and objectives, then we started talking about the timeline. Lo and behold, the election is coming. And we're very eager to see the outcome of the election. In one hand, we sort of like where we're going in terms of the various legislations and policies that currently develop, because now we're in the redefining phase of those policies and legislation. But if for whatever reason there's a drastic change in the provincial political environment, then all the work that we've done can possibly go for naught. But the one thing that I did note to the current government is that regardless of the outcome of the election, we're not going anywhere. We're still going to be here when you come and discuss resource development in our territory. One thing that I credit Chief Alan Gustafson, whom and I, although as a past chief and Chief Alan as a current chief, one thing that we can agree on and how we deliberate our discussions on moving forward, the analogy that he uses all the time is, what are the current successes and challenges facing White Sand First Nation? So in building a green economy, what is the current successes and challenges? Like I said, we have various pieces of legislation in place, but unfortunately, we have an election happening soon that could probably change that. We also have the collapse of the forestry industry that unfortunately unfolded here in Northwestern Ontario for the past few years. So we're asking ourselves now, how can we learn from the mistakes that we made and improve on those mistakes so that this doesn't likely happen again? So when White Sand is looking for a path forward, the one thing that we quickly realize is that in order to create sustainable development in the area of forestry, we need to create a market for the various value-added products that we like to get into. And just recently, we've been invited to Germany and next week on a trade mission on value-added products. The other thing, I like the way I phrase this one, political will. And the reason why I did that is because we constantly ask ourselves, as a First Nation, will the current political environment accept in dealing with First Nations on an equal basis? If so, will there be the political will to develop policy and legislation to ensure that we secure a strong partnership with all levels of government, especially in and around protecting our environment? One of the questions that I asked earlier, and I think it's a really a question that needs to be discussed, is how do we develop a measuring system and achieve a balanced perspective on a green economy? One thing that I really got to share this story, and my wife, when I get into this mode about thinking about the environment, she says, "You're boring me." My wife and I recently went on a road trip, and it was her turn to drive, and I said to myself, you know, there's got to be something on the radio. And we just happened to be between somewhere where there's no radio, and the only radio station I found was CBC. And there was a forum on the discussion on sustainable development, achieving sustainable development from a global perspective. And there's these two world chief economists having this lengthy debate on how we achieve that. And surprisingly, after listening to it for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, and my wife almost fell asleep. But anyways, the thing that got me was that, and somebody mentioned that there's two leading countries today who are talking about trying to achieve sustainable development, and that's China and India. Then one of the, and this is a funny one, one of the chief economists, I can't remember which one it was, but anyways, he said the only way we're going to achieve sustainable development is if those leading countries today, like China and India, the only way they can achieve sustainability is if they control the population. And it got to the point, and that's where I turned it off, where they were talking about contraception. But anyways, I'll just leave that at that. White Sand's vision towards a green economy. The White Sand Community Sustainability Initiative has been a prime objective improvement of White Sand's economic fortunes. This can be accomplished through our leading and developing in business opportunities focused on the economic potential of the natural resources within our traditional territory. CSI is not a new approach. In 1992, White Sand submitted a proposal for the Armstrong Forest model, which was declined. And it talks about the various ways of changing the way we look at the forest today. So our proposal is just a document that we dusted off and polished up. Since then, White Sand First Nation has trying to, and this is part of the frustration in trying to move forward. Although very few of us will admit that we make mistakes in terms of protecting the environment, when White Sand is in the forefront trying to demonstrate how poor practice can lead to good practice, nobody tends to listen. Especially when resource extraction takes place in our territory and there's very little community benefit. Today's sustainable approach, our main point of the CSI is protecting the water, the land, the wildlife. White Sand is also seeking new approaches within forest management, which includes respect and protection of our cultural resources, traditional activities. Community management is a way of life. Economics and education, and employment and environment can come together sustainable. They do not have to be opposed or separated. And somebody talked about having to think in silo. When White Sand looks at things, it doesn't look things at silo. It sort of looks at things holistically. And just to give you one of the startling examples that we discovered in terms of ensuring that we succeed in not only protecting the environment, but succeed in resource development. Somebody talked about some of the educational gaps. And this was one of the startling statistics that we came to find, not only in our community, but other communities as well. Approximately out of 80 assessments, educational assessments that we completed in our community, there was only a 3% success rate in secondary, 1% in post-secondary. So there's some huge educational gaps. This is some of our elders that are heavily engaged in creating a path forward. CSI will be a green economy success. This is some of the projects that we're currently involved in. We're involved in developing a pellet plant, a cogen, and a sawmill. I really wanted to vent this morning regarding some of the funding opportunities and some of the criteria in developing contracts to produce green energy, but I reluctantly did so. The White Sand pellet plant, we tend to produce 80 tons per hour, 67 tons a year. This is only utilizing probably about 25% of what we've been allotted through the competitive wood supply process. We're currently, like I said, conducting or developing marketing studies for some of the other underutilized species on the Armstrong forest. White sand power generation. Again, the idea is to use the biomass wood waste from the forest to create electricity and get us off diesel. The White Sand sawmill, like I said, again, we're still doing feasibility studies, market analysis. Employment impact and permanent jobs. Somebody might ask, and if I can get right to the end here, is 59 jobs sustainable for your community? For us, one job sustainable. I apologize for this one. Employment impact seasonal, that's supposed to be green. 60 part-time jobs. What does a CSI mean for White Sand First Nation? Pride and ownership. Management of our traditional lands. Removal of diesel power. Creation of 120 jobs. Approximately $3.7 million in wages. Generate approximately $3.5 million in revenue. Issues that we still face, like I mentioned, we face a challenge of creating a skilled workforce. We still face a challenge of raising capital. We're still lobbying the government for us to create a proper assessment of what's on the landscape. We're currently negotiating under the new 10-year system as to what it could look like and how we get there. In the end, the community sustainability initiative is about a long-term responsibility and accountability for White Sand's economic and cultural and environmental future. ownership for the future can only rest with White Sand. However, we're looking for willing and like-minded partners to assist White Sand in accomplishing this journey on a green economy. Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll start.
We just have one or two questions.
I'd like to ask you something. I grew up in a place called Audensville on the map, and then Bobbyca was there. And I didn't realize until later that I would have Aboriginal grandchildren and daughters of Aboriginal blood in my family. But I was surprised at the time because the Abitibi was moving too quickly with cutting down the wood. And there was nothing. There wasn't anything at that time except trucks going here, there, all over. Down the highway, into Thunder Bay, all over. And then suddenly went up the Boreal Road, and my husband and I went camping up that way. And we used to see all kinds of trucks go that way, up and down that way. Now there isn't anymore. And I was with Environment North on the board. We had gotten done the recycling and use movement. Thank goodness for that. But the thing that puzzled me, why wasn't all this discussed a long time ago instead of getting that almighty dollar and then pushing everything out of its way? And I'm a little upset over all of that. Something happened.
I can concur with you on that comment.
I just thank you very much for this presentation. As you spoke, I kept thinking that there is a Romeo, I don't know his last name, First Nations candidate, listening to NDP person. Thank you. And I'm thinking perhaps people need for Romeo, symbolically speaking, as a consort to Mother Earth at this time, in the highest position. Do you understand? It's symbolically speaking, we need a Romeo as a consort for Mother Earth at this time, the highest power, to make all this transition. But I'm referring to Shakespearean play, Romeo and Juliet, the last story, the great last story.
If I could just try to relate to that, like I said, if you saw the picture of our elders, again, they reached to the higher power in developing and understanding how they fit in terms of protecting the environment. So I don't know if that's a term from Shakespeare, but that I think not only being spiritual, but like I said, we have a very strong cultural connection to the land.
How do you think non-Aboriginal people can support you in your work?
That's a very good question. Like I said, our main objective is to not only educate society, but have governments change their mindset and how they view First Nations. Somebody from Southern Ontario mentioned about something about that question, and she had indicated that First Nation, Southern Ontario people have developed a compassion for First Nation people. And I said, you know what, thank you for the compassion, but I think compassion, we need a little bit more than that in terms of supporting our goals and objectives. We need society to make every effort to better understand First Nation people. Unfortunately, we're a long ways from that. I read the editorial, I don't know if you guys did yesterday. I thought I was going to read a really nice editorial on forests and trees. But again, I was a bit disturbed in how that was conveyed in terms of some of the social issues that First Nation people are facing. You have to read it and see it from my perspective. Yeah, it was in the other day in the Chronicle Journal. It's called Forests and Trees, but it had nothing to do with forests and trees.
Thanks very much, Clifford, for that talk.
Peter, should I turn it back over to you? I guess just one comment I wanted to make when Clifford was talking about political will, we do have the candidates from Thunder Bay Superior North here tomorrow at 11 in the morning. So, you know, we can invite our friends too. They don't necessarily need to be registered for the workshops. To try and get people out to ask some of those important questions would be a good idea, I think.
So finally, lunchtime. I know that it was a late lunch, and even a bit later than it was scheduled for on the agenda. We do have the film So Right, So Smart scheduled to watch during lunch, and I'd like to invite Charlene to come up and introduce it, and then you can feel free to go grab a plate and fill it up.